All right, it's week 14 fantasy football, and we're heading into the playoffs, so don't kid yourself. You're looking for a win more than the one guy on the internet that thinks Ronald Jones is still good. But don't worry, we got you covered talking running backs right now. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake Fantasy Headliners. Hope you guys are all doing well out there. Welcome to week 14 now, fantasy football, when we're heading into the playoffs and we're talking about running backs. Now, throughout the season, you see a lot of people always say, always start your studs. Well, sometimes that backfires in the regular season, and you have some chances to maybe gamble a little bit. But once you get to this section of the season, it's not time to gamble much anymore. Looking for your studs, looking for the safer place to try to carry you to fantasy football championship. So today we're talking about the running back position. Going to be going through every matchup still, even though we're in the playoffs, trying to help as many people as we possibly can. Once again, though, don't get overly caught up with what column these guys are in. Listen to the information provided, and let that be what helps you determine who you start or sit here this week for your fantasy football team. This is just kind of my take looking from it, from the outside looking in. But before we get into week 14, let's see how we did week 13 for the running back position. Overall, solid week for week 13, the running back position. We had a total of 57 running backs, so we gave a start or sit designation to last week that completed their games. Out of those 57, 37 were correct for an accuracy percentage of 65%. Some of our biggest hits, James White. I could kind of see that, his role in this game was going to be improving. Was I expecting that much from James White in week 13? No, absolutely not. But a great week for him. Definite hit. Miles Sanders had a great matchup against the Dolphins. He was a hit. Devin Singletary on Thanksgiving Day had him listed as a start. Joe Mixon, a lot of people that had some question marks about him with Andy Dalton returning. He was a hit. And then Devontae Freeman. A lot of people question the fact that I had him as a sit last week, being that he was going to be the lone starter there to get a lot of volume, and he did, but he did not perform, so that was a hit for us also. Some of the biggest misses, Darius Geis, and heck, you could actually put Adrian Peterson right here next to him if you wanted to. I knew there was going to be a split. I didn't expect both of them to see that much production. They both played great. They were a miss. Rashad Penny and Chris Carson, another duo here. Going into the week last week, that we just didn't know what type of volume each of them were going to see against a pretty stout Minnesota run defense. It didn't seem to matter. They both balled out, and they were misses also. Raheem Mostert, beginning of the week, we didn't know if Matt Breida was going to play. Raheem Mostert came out and played great. He was a miss. And then this D. Johnson. No, it's not David Johnson. Everybody was expecting him to suck. Nope, this was Duke Johnson. Went out there and had himself a huge week. He was a miss, not something that we felt we could trust heading into the playoff stretch. He was a miss for us. But now we're heading into week 14. Who can we trust in our lineups? That's what we're talking about right now. And we're going to go through all of the matchups here to try to help you set your lineups. Thursday Night Football, first game of the week, Dallas Cowboys, Chicago Bears. And a lot of people still unhappy with Zeke Elliott out there, not putting up huge numbers, but he's still running back 6 overall in half-point PPR scoring. And yeah, the yardage numbers are a little down, but the touchdowns are still there. He's got 8 on the season. The last 2 seasons, he had 9 each of the last 2 seasons. So it's not like there's some big, huge drop-off there where there's really been a big drop-off to lose some of that value that we were expecting here in 2019. It's his lack of involvement in the passing game. Last season, he had 77 receptions. So far this year, only on pace to complete the year with 52 receptions here in 2019. That's a big drop-off, but Buffalo, they allow right around 18 fantasy points per game, and Dallas needs Zeke more than ever. They need to start winning some ball games, and the offense needs to start going through Ezekiel Elliott a lot more than it has the past couple weeks. In my opinion, obviously, Zeke Elliott, not somebody you're going to sit here right around the playoff time. Now, for Chicago, you got David Montgomery and Tariq Cohen. I like Tariq Cohen. He just doesn't see consistent enough volume or enough volume on a weekly basis to make him anywhere near safe here for the playoff stretch. So it's really David Montgomery. And this guy is about as hard to figure out as a Rubik's Cube. I have no idea what to expect from him, but it's not all on him. It's the play calling also. It's the play of Mitch Trubisky on a weekly basis. If Mitch can, move the ball down the field through the air, that really opens up the running game for David Montgomery. The problem is Mitch Trubisky sometimes doesn't look like he's ever played quarterback in his life, and you never know what to expect on a weekly basis. But right now, Dallas allowing right around the same 18 fantasy points per game. David Montgomery's going to go out there. He's going to touch the ball right around 15 times a game. Yes, he is somewhat touchdown dependent, though. I have him in the start column because of the volume that he's going to see. Now, Is he one of these slam dunk safe options? No, he's not. I would prefer him to be a flex play at best, but somebody who's going to go out there, and get that 15 to 18 touches with that touchdown upside. All we got to hope for is for Mitch Trubisky to move the ball down the field, and David Montgomery would make a pretty solid flex play for you here in Week 14. Panthers and Falcons up now, and let me get this straight. So last week, Christian McCaffrey had his worst game of the season since Week 2 against the Washington Redskins. I don't understand. I don't get it, but I mean, let's look at the numbers a little bit better. He didn't have a bad game. He didn't have a normal Christian McCaffrey huge game, but he was still a solid running back. Don't get me wrong. He had over 100 total yards, 7 receptions, really give him that safe floor on a weekly basis. He faced this same defense back in Week 11 just a couple weeks ago and did just fine. He had 25 total touches and 191 total yards. Heck, he had 14 targets in that game. The volume is going to be huge. Carolina let go of Ron Rivera today. There'll be a new interim coach here starting this week, and then they'll probably have somebody new coming in the offseason. But, I mean, this is not a team that's really playing for a whole lot in Carolina right now. Their one bright spot really is Christian McCaffrey, unless you want to include DJ Moore, who's really been playing great here as of late. But don't worry about Christian McCaffrey. One bad game doesn't mean he's not somebody you can trust. He's obviously in your lineup. Now, for Atlanta, you got Devontae Freeman. A lot of people, like I said earlier, didn't agree with me sitting him last week because of the volume that he was going to see. Deservedly so. And the guy touched the ball 21 times last week. That's great. That's what we're looking for. The problem is, only had 64 total yards and no touchdowns. But now, he gets a matchup against the Carolina Panthers, who suck at all things run defense. They're allowing 25.8 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's number 1 in the NFL. The most allowed points of any team in the NFL. Great matchup here for one Devonta Freeman. He's definitely going back into the lineup. Don't forget, this same Carolina defense was shredded last week by Darius Geisen and Adrian Peterson. And this is just a great matchup overall for Devonta Freeman. The volume should be there once again, and he's definitely somebody that's going back into my starting lineup. Colts and Bucks up next, and I don't know if I've ever sat this many names in one game before. This may be a record for yeah, it is. This is a record for the show. I couldn't fit another name on there if I wanted to without cutting a letter off. But I mean, what do we do now with the Indianapolis Colts backfield? Jonathan Williams basically fell off. A lot of touches going towards Jordan Wilkins, Nyheim Hines. Does Marlon Mack possibly come back this week? That's a possibility. And now, pair that with the fact that they're going up against Tampa Bay, who is number 2 in the NFL against opposing running backs with fantasy points allowed at only 11.4 points per game. I'm not really, wanting to risk my playoff life, my fantasy football season on the backfield right now of the Indianapolis Colts. Too hard to peg who's going to get the bulk of the touches. 2 weeks ago, everybody thought Jonathan Williams was going to run away with his job until Marlon Mack came back. Then he just disappeared and really threw a wrench in this entire backfield. I'm avoiding all of the Colts running backs here this week, especially with the tough matchup. Now, something totally different for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I absolutely love this backfield this week. Just kidding. No, I don't. They still suck. I mean, where are all the Ronald Jones truthers at now? They've been pretty quiet as of late. Guy had 6 carries for 8 yards and was benched for missing blitz pickups. You got Peyton Barber out there stealing touchdowns. Indianapolis is already a top 5 run defense themselves. They're only allowing 14.4 fantasy points per game. So let me ask you this one. If your fantasy football season is on the line, are you trusting Ronald Jones or Peyton Barber? No, you're not. Dolphins and Jets up now, and finally we don't have to talk about Kalen Ballage very much for the Miami Dolphins. I mean, that dude made Ronald Jones look elite at times. So now we're talking about Myles Gaskin and Patrick Laird in the backfield for the Miami Dolphins, and they got to be better than Kalen Ballage, right? I mean, Laird showed that he could have some pass game upside last week. He saw 5 targets, 4 receptions, 43 yards, and a touchdown. But the Jets only allow 16.1 fantasy points per game, and Miami isn't really known for their running game regardless. Now, if you're in a deep league, larger than 12 teams, and you're looking for a PPR flex, Patrick Laird has some potential upside in this game. If you're in a normal 10, 12 team league, there's probably better options out there, and he's not worth the risk. But in those larger leagues, somebody that I may take a stab on if needed. For the Jets, though, you have Le'Veon Bell. A lot of people still frustrated with his production, myself included. But Miami is a great matchup for him. They allow over 22 fantasy points per game. And even though Bell still struggles to put up those big numbers, he's running back 12 on the season overall in half-point PPR. This could very easily be his first 100-yard game, and he's one of those studs that we're just going to start here in the playoffs and hope that he can carry us on a week-to-week basis. He's going in the lineup. Niners and Saints up now, and will somebody please push or carry or throw Alvin Kamara into the end zone at some point, please? I mean, the guy is just killing us with a lack of touchdowns right now, but his passing work is still making him a solid weekly start, just not huge numbers. He hasn't had a game yet with less than 8 targets since week 5, but this is a horrible time for a tough matchup going up against the San Francisco run defense, who only allows 12.3 fantasy points per game. We already know about the defense of the San Francisco 49ers, so we are kind of looking at maybe possibly another one of those average weeks from Alvin Kamara. Obviously, though, in your starting lineup, one of your studs, you got to start him. But for San Francisco, I mean, are we kind of trending back, heading back towards the hashtag of must start Mostert? Because the guy looked absolutely great last week against the Baltimore defense, a very tough defense. Tevin Coleman has kind of looked like he's just given up altogether, like he doesn't expect to be back in San Francisco next year. He's not a safe start at this point. What if Matt Breida comes back? He's kind of, something else in this equation that we really don't know as of yet. What if Breida does come back? Are we looking at a 3-man backfield? Because if that's the case in a tough matchup, I really don't want any part of it. Now, if you have Mostert, you're kind of hoping that Matt Breida sits, and then all of a sudden, I don't mind Raheem Mostert. He is the better back in this backfield as of right now, but it's not an easy matchup for him either. The run defense of the New Orleans Saints isn't much worse than the run defense of the San Francisco 49ers. New Orleans only allows 12.8 fantasy points per game. That's third in the NFL. I can't trust Coleman. I really don't know if Breida is healthy and if he's going to be limited if he does play. So at this point, as of right now, at the time of this recording, Raheem Mostert's the only back that I touch here this week for the San Francisco 49ers. Lions and Vikings up now, and please, in the name of all things holy, let Dalvin Cook be healthy. I mean, he's already come out and said that he's going to play, he's fine, but here's my concern. If the Vikings get a lead here, maybe the entire second half, maybe they jump out early, whatever it is, maybe they just limit his touches, and we see a lot more Alexander Mattison this week up against the Detroit Lions than we see Dalvin Cook trying to rest him to not put him in harm's way when they really don't need him possibly this week. That's the problem. That's what I'm worried about with Dalvin Cook, but at this point, you just kind of got to cross your fingers and throw him in your lineup. He's gotten you this far. You're hoping for some production early in that game. So if he does sit late, you have your production early on, and it doesn't totally cripple your fantasy football team. Now, if you're in a league like 12 teams or larger, I like Alexander Mattison. I'll throw him in a flex spot this week. I think he has huge upside in a great matchup against a poor run defense of the Detroit Lions. He could have himself a very solid day here and be a little bit of a surprise for a lot of people. Now, I'd like to think that the Minnesota run defense was pretty good. I mean, they were coming into last week, and then between Rashad Penny and Chris Carson, they rushed for a combined 176 yards against them. They only allowed 13.4 fantasy points per game, and then they got torched by Seattle, but the running game in Detroit is no Seattle running game. I mean, yes, Bo Scarborough's out there, and he's going to touch the ball between 15 and 18 times, which is great. The problem is, I don't know if I want to risk it in the fantasy playoffs with Bo Scarborough at this point. He's somewhat inefficient and touchdown dependent. If he doesn't get it, he's going to hurt your roster. So for right now, I have all of the Detroit Lions running backs, Bo Scarborough, Ty Johnson, J.D. McKissick, all in the sit column. Denver and Houston up now, and for all the Phillip Lindsay owners out there, this is the week that you need Phillip Lindsay to come through. I mean, as of right now, he's still running back 14 overall in half-point PPR scoring, so that's not bad, but he does have 3 straight games in single digits, and that's not helping anybody this time of year. But the big game, the big plays, they're about to happen. I mean, this is somebody who, for his career so far, even though it's a short career, is averaging 1 touchdown every 28 touches. It's been 56 touches since his last touchdown, so we'll just say he's due. And now he's going up against the Houston Texans run defense, who allows over 20 fantasy points per game. And look what James White did against them last week. Could that be something similar with Phillip Lindsay here in week 14? He's definitely somebody that I'm looking forward to starting here this week. Now, for Houston, the running game's kind of taken a back seat here as of late, but really the reason why, all of their pass-catching weapons are healthy. I mean, very few times this year they've had a healthy, DeAndre Hopkins with Will Fuller and Kenny Stills, Duke Johnson in the backfield. He's starting to get more involved, especially in the red zone. He's actually taking some of these close touchdowns away from Carlos Hyde, and it's really hurting Carlos Hyde's safety and his reliability on a weekly basis. Hyde's not involved in the passing game, and Duke Johnson's not involved really in the running game. It makes them both very risky starts. It takes away their safe floor, especially in PPR scoring formats. Now, if you're in a deep PPR league, Duke Johnson, somebody that you may want to take a stab at, but there is risk involved. If I have the chance, the opportunity, I'm not risking it on either Carlos Hyde or Duke Johnson here this week. Ravens and Bills up now, and we're hopping back on the bandwagon of one Mark Ingram. Whoop, whoop. And if you don't like it, come see me. Sorry, I was, channeling my inner Ingram. Never mind. Anyway, he was held in check for the most part last week against the San Francisco 49ers. I get that. It was a very difficult matchup. One that's a lot better this week going up against Buffalo, who allows over 18 fantasy points per game. In fact, Buffalo, they have allowed 13 running backs so far this season to finish inside the top 24 in scoring. Baltimore can move the ball on anybody, right? We know that. And we know Mark Ingram, as long as the game is close, is going to touch the ball between 15 and 18 times a game. He's somebody who I want in my lineup on a weekly basis just for the touchdown upside alone in this offense, which is arguably one of the best in all of football. Now, for Buffalo, it's really just Devin Singletary. He's got 2 straight games now scoring in double-digit fantasy points. But if they could add him in the passing game just a little bit more, it makes that floor that much safer. He's had at least 17 touches here over the last 2 games, which is a plus. And Baltimore, even though they only allow 17 fantasy points per game, were just torn apart by Raheem Mostert last week. Similar running style kind of Devin Singletary. Could he have the same success? He's number 1 in the NFL right now in yards per carry at 5.6, and he's averaging a breakaway run, which is a run over 15 yards, 1 every 10 carries. The big playability is there. Yes, there's some risk in the matchup, but I'm taking it this week with Devin Singletary. Bengals and Browns up now, and Nick Chubb is coming off his first game since week 5 where he didn't have at least 20-plus touches. But this is a much better matchup for one Nick Chubb, and let's just be realistic here. Pittsburgh just kind of seems to be his kryptonite this year. Now, Cincinnati, a lot better matchup. They allow over 21 fantasy points per game, so both Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb are going to be starts for me again this week. Now, Kareem Hunt, the ceiling isn't quite as high for him, but the floor is way higher. I mean, he's a safe play right now, especially in PPR leagues. He's somebody that has that 10-point floor for the most part here this weekend, and he's going to be that safer play. Nick Chubb, higher ceiling, a little bit more risk, maybe a little bit more touchdown dependent, but the volume should be there still for Nick Chubb. I expect him to get over 20 carries in this game, especially a lot of garbage time here second half. I'm going to fire up both Hunt and Chubb. Now, for the Cincinnati Bengals, there was some concern coming into last week that maybe first half Joe Mixon kind of returned with Andy Dalton back under center. The inefficient Joe Mixon that pissed off a lot of fantasy owners the first 8 weeks of the season. And he kind of did return. 19 carries for 44 yards, 4 receptions for 26, but he had a touchdown that really saved his fantasy day. For whatever reason, he kind of just becomes more, inefficient with Andy Dalton under center. And I don't understand why, because Andy Dalton's moving the ball down the field through the air better than Ryan Finley was. That should only open up the run game for Joe Mixon, but Cleveland, they do allow just under 18 fantasy points per game. The volume should be there. Once again, he'll see 20 touches combined in this game, I would think. He's a risk, right? But he's more of a low-end running back, too. Hopefully, by this point in the season, you're not counting on him to be the Lord and Savior of your fantasy football team. So there's risk there a little bit, but I think the upside kind of outweighs that as long as you go into this matchup thinking of it as more of an RB2 high-end flex play, depending on what other options you have. Redskins and Packers up now, and don't just look at the names in the column and click off the video and go to another matchup. Listen to what we have to say about this one here, because it may change your mind a little bit. Now, first off, for the Packers, I mean, Aaron Jones has had a couple bad games, but I'm going to blame the last 2 on a tough matchup and horrible weather last week. Now, a much better matchup this week going up against the Washington Redskins, who, yes, played pretty well against, Christian McCaffrey last week. Limited him somewhat, as much as you can limit Christian McCaffrey. But they still do allow just under 20 fantasy points per game. Jones' ceiling, it's way too high to sit. We've seen this guy single-handedly win fantasy matchups basically by himself. He needs to be in your lineup. Now, Jamal Williams, his passing game, the work in his passing game, really makes him a safe play on a weekly basis. It's just the ceiling is not really there. Kind of similar to Kareem Hunt in that fact that he's going to score right around 10 fantasy points a game. Yeah, he'll have the occasional, big game, multiple touchdown game, but not something you can count on a weekly basis. Can't really win you your fantasy matchup like an Aaron Jones could, but he's a solid play, especially in those 12-team leagues or larger, as your flex play. Now, going for the Washington Redskins. This is risk, right? Last week on this show, I sat here and said how much I love Darius Geis, that I didn't know if he was going to get the opportunity this year, that he may be more of somebody that we look at heavily in 2020 as long as he stays healthy. And then he went out there on minimal touches and had himself a huge game. That's what you can expect at times from Darius Geis, that the guy could just stay on the field. I just didn't know what kind of split were we going to see between him and Adrian Peterson. But Green Bay, they allow over 22 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, 5th most in the NFL. Adrian Peterson is going to stay involved. They're not going to go out there and give Darius Geis 20 to 25 touches on a weekly basis. They're trying to keep him healthy, and they'll just run Adrian Peterson into the ground, who continues to see more volume on the ground than Darius Geis does. Now, for both of these guys in a matchup in which that they could find some success here against Green Bay, and let's be real, the Washington passing game is not exactly exploding right now. They need to rely a little bit more on that short passing game with running backs and the running game. I can see both of these guys, having a solid day, but don't be, confused here. There is risk with this one. This is not a slam dunk by any means. These guys are flex plays at best. Hopefully you're in a 12-team league or larger, because like I said, the risk is going to be there. The floor is very low for both of these guys, but the ceiling could carry you to a fantasy victory. Chargers and Jags here. This one is pretty straightforward, right? Leonard Fournette, obvious must start at this point so far on the season. 220 carries, 65 receptions, 1,400 total yards already for Leonard Fournette. We know that Gardner Minshew Mania is back under center. Maybe he opens up the passing game a little bit more than Nick Foles could and opens more running lanes for Leonard Fournette. The Chargers allow just over 20 fantasy points per game, and with this passing game work on a weekly basis for Leonard Fournette, it's somebody that by no means are you even looking at or thinking about sitting here in Week 14. For the Chargers, though, I'm going to continue to roll with Melvin Gordon and Austin Eckler in the start column, more than likely remainder of the season. Ever since Anthony Lynn took over play calling duties there for the Chargers, both Melvin and Eckler are inside the top 14 overall for the running back position in half-point PPR scoring. Gordon, he's seen at least 20 carries on the ground 3 of his last 4 games, and Austin Eckler has scored double-digit fantasy points 10 out of 12 games played. Jacksonville, they allow over 21 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, 6th most in the NFL, with the volume and the matchup, both of these guys in the start column. Steelers and Cardinals up next, and this game, for me, may be one of the hardest to figure out from the running back position. I mean, does James Conner return? It doesn't sound like it, but we don't know that for sure yet. If he sits, all of a sudden, Benny Snell is a decent flex option. Not so much of a PPR guy, more of a standard play, but kind of gives you that safe floor because he'll go out there and touch the ball between 15 and 20 times this week, but he needs that touchdown to really, give you that solid fantasy day. But the Cardinals are a great matchup. They give up over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and Trey Edmonds and Jalen Samuels, they haven't been overly involved in this offense, so it becomes one of those safer flex plays for Benny Snell if James Conner does sit. Now, what if James Conner plays? I have to think that he's healthy enough to go out there and get decent volume. Otherwise, they wouldn't rush him back. I mean, Benny Snell has been decent for the past couple weeks, so it's not like they're dying without James Conner. I mean, they have Devlin Hodges as their quarterback, who the dude seems to be like, the GOAT on social media, going out hunting with all of his wide receivers, putting up decent numbers. I mean, whatever it is, this is a very difficult game to try to peg on the Steelers side of things until we know the exact health of James Conner. It's not much easier, though, for the Arizona Cardinals, right? I mean, you got Kenyon Drake, who seems to be the clear number one now in this backfield. David Johnson, who's basically disappeared. Chase Edmonds, who didn't even get a snap last week. So what do you do in this backfield? I mean, it seems like it's Kenyon Drake, and he has that possible upside, but a tough matchup. The Pittsburgh Steelers only allow 14.7 fantasy points per game, which is 6th fewest in the NFL. Not ideal on this side of the ball either. If you're in a 12-team league or larger, you're looking for a flex play, the upside is still there for Kenyon Drake. Some risk involved, but if you're looking for a name, if you're looking for somebody to fill a spot, Kenyon Drake is somebody who I'd take, a look at. I'm just not overly excited, and I don't have that great feeling if I have to put him in my lineup here in Week 14. Titans and Raiders up next, and it doesn't get much easier than this one for me. I mean, how great has Derrick Henry been lately? Well, he's currently up to running back 3 overall in fantasy football, and he's only like 30 points behind Dalvin Cook, who's been absolutely killing it most of the season. He's had 4 straight games with at least 22 fantasy points and half-point PPR scoring. He's had 7 touchdowns over the last 4 games. Now, he gets the Oakland Raiders, who allow over 20 fantasy points per game. Do I need to go any further? Obviously, if you got Derrick Henry, he's in your starting lineup. But Josh Jacobs, he's coming off another 100-yard game, his 5th one of those this season. But the Oakland offense is really struggling to move the ball, and it's kind of limiting the touchdown upside that Josh Jacobs was getting to begin the season. Without those touchdowns, he gives you a safe floor, but the ceiling just isn't quite as high until they can start moving the ball through the air. He's still going to be a start. Tennessee does allow only 18.6 fantasy points per game, but with Jacobs there, I don't expect you to have very many better options. The safety is there. The decent floor is there, which is what we're looking for here in Week 14. Just cross your fingers he can find the end zone once or twice, because he can really carry your fantasy team this week. Chiefs and Patriots up now. In 2018, James White finally returned for us last week, and I kind of expect him to do it again here this week against the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, right now, Tom Brady doesn't trust too many of his wide receivers. I mean, you see him on the sidelines getting angry, telling them to be more explosive, be quicker, try to win their matchups. He's just not overly happy. So what does that mean? It means he goes to his 2 favorite targets of Julian Edelman and a whole lot of James White. Sony Michel, if you've noticed lately, he'll come out early. They'll pound the rock early with Sony Michel in the first quarter to try to establish that running game. If he really doesn't do anything, if he's ineffective, he basically is non-existent rest of the game, and you start to see a lot more James White. But this is a decent matchup for them. I mean, Kansas City allows over 24 fantasy points per game. So James White, especially in PPR leagues, an automatic start for me this week. I can see him getting double-digit targets here once again this week, kind of similar to what we saw last year with James White. Sony Michel, I have him as a start, but it really depends on what other options you have. He's not a for sure start, a must start by any means, but I do think that they try to rely on this run game a little bit more until they get this passing game figured out. It's their only option to really move forward and have a chance in this game. I mean, I can see the Patriots dropping this game if they don't find success early against the Kansas City Chiefs. But what do we do with the Kansas City Chiefs side of things? This is turning into a steaming pile of dog crap for the Kansas City Chiefs run game. Darrell Williams sounds like he may be done for the season. Damian Williams doesn't sound like he's going to play. They just signed Spencer Ware, and Darwin Thompson and LaShawn McCoy, as of right now, are most up to speed with this team going forward. The problem is, LaShawn McCoy, he's basically on somewhat of a pitch count, right? He hasn't seen double-digit carries since Week 7. Last week alone, Darwin Thompson had 11. But it's not an easy matchup for these guys either, going up against the best run defense in all football, the Patriots, who only allow 11.2 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Not ideal at all. However, if you want to gamble, you can see it highlighted in yellow. High risk, high reward. A lot of people think Spencer Ware are going to come in and just take over this backfield for right now. I don't see that happening this week. Yes, he knows the system. He knows the Andy Reid offense. He's played there before. I get all of that. But I have a feeling this is the week that Darwin Thompson gets an opportunity. Maybe more of a DFS play. Maybe more of a 14-team and larger play, because there is some high risk associated here with Darwin Thompson. But if you're looking for a Hail Mary, if it comes down to it where you just need to try to find something to make up a huge difference in points, Darwin Thompson has that ability this week. Just not somebody who I can overly count on at this point. Seahawks and Rams, and maybe when we started the season, we thought that this matchup at the end of the year may be a little bit, have a little bit more on the line, but now that we're here, it really doesn't have that much on the line. And then last week, for the Seattle Seahawks, I really questioned this backfield. What were we going to see out of Carson and Penny? Carson had fumbling issues. What was Penny's usage going to be? It was a tough matchup last week against the Minnesota run defense, supposedly. Well, none of that mattered. Like, literally, None of it. Carson and Penny both killed it last week with a combined 176 total rushing yards between the two of them. So now that we know that, now that both of these guys, they've kind of figured out a role for each of them, they're going to be in the lineup. I mean, Chris Carson is obviously somebody who they are still committed to, and they don't seem to care too much about the fumbling issues of the past couple weeks. Rashad Penny, more explosive, more big play. Chris Carson, more the ground and pound, the safer play here going forward. But this is a team that is a run-first team for the most part. They run over 30 times a game. So Chris Carson, a running back to Rashad Penny, more of a flex play at best with that huge upside here this week going up against the Rams, who seemed to somewhat figure out some of their offensive woes last week. However, they played the Arizona Cardinals, so take that with a grain of salt. But on the Rams side, you had Todd Gurley, who had one of his best games of the week last week against Arizona. But Seattle only allows just over 15 fantasy points per game, so this is no, walk in the park for Todd Gurley. But the usage, it's there for Todd Gurley finally. They're finally committing to him here at the very end of the season. They kind of realize that they're not really going to win this division by any means, but they're still trying to make a valiant effort to get this offense back on the right track and move it forward here into the offseason. Todd Gurley, still part of the game plan, still heavy volume, and hopefully he can really be involved in the passing game this week. That would really give him that safe floor. But just like I said at the beginning, we're starting our studs. He's in our lineup. Monday Night Football, Giants and Eagles here this week. And I know we're talking about starting our studs, but what about Saquon Barkley? I mean, he's been absolutely horrendous almost this entire season. What do we do with him? I mean, he's had 4 straight games without a touchdown. He hasn't had a 100-yard rushing game since week 2. But the biggest problem for Saquon Barkley, he only has 5 total receptions over the last 2 games combined. That's a lot of lost value for Saquon Barkley. He's definitely somebody who should be more involved in this passing game like he was last year. That's what really put him over the top with points scored. And Philadelphia is no easy matchup. They only allow 15.9 fantasy points per game, but we can't afford to sit Saquon Barkley at this point. We need him to break a big run. It's tough because he's not producing for your team right now, and you spent a first-round pick, a top 4 pick on him in your fantasy football league. It's tough. You got to bite the bullet, start him this week, and hopefully that you find a big play that really carries you throughout this fantasy game, throughout this matchup here this week. But for the Eagles, what's going on here? Does Jordan Howard return? If he does, he's probably going to be limited. Jay Ajayi hasn't really been a thing. It's really just been Miles Sanders for the most part, who's averaging just over 18 touches over his last 2 games and also averaging 5 yards per touch. So he's actually producing with the volume that he's getting. That's what we're looking for, a decent matchup for him going up against the New York Giants. With Jordan Howard's status still somewhat unknown as of right now, Miles Sanders is the only guy who I would start this week. He would be a flex option for me if I'm looking for somebody who I know is going to go out there and get some volume in a decent matchup and has that pass-catching upside. Miles Sanders for me is a solid flex play here week 14. All right, those are all my starts and sits here, week 14 fantasy football. Do me a favor if you could hit that like button for us. We greatly appreciate the support. We've had a lot of fun this year, and we're going to take you all the way through week 17. For everybody who's out there playing all 17 weeks, we have you covered. We greatly appreciate it once again. Hopefully you had a great Thanksgiving. Make sure you leave a comment down below. We're trying to get the community to interact with each other as much as humanly possible. And then myself, Kyle, Max, some of the guys are trying to be as active as we can in the comment section to respond to as many of you guys as we possibly can. We greatly appreciate you once again. Looking forward to the holiday season. Looking forward to some fantasy championships. And we'll talk to you later.